Not long after the United States won its independence, something happened that the founders didn't quite know how to talk about yet. Americans started rebelling again, not against Britain, against themselves. And I don't mean political disagreement, I mean unrest, defiance, crowds, threats. Officials were intimidated and courts were disrupted. A refusal to comply with laws passed by a government that was supposed to represent them. If you grew up on the clean version of the founding story, that part can feel almost off script. Like, we just did the revolution. We just fought a war. We just made the big moral case. How are we already here? But we were, and quickly. And the people deciding how to respond weren't royal governors across an ocean. They weren't faceless bureaucrats. They were the same men who had once defended resistance as necessary. The same men who had justified disruption, publicly, passionately, as the only remaining language when the power stops listening. That's the moment I can't stop thinking about. What does it do to you, psychologically, when you go from resisting authority to being it? How do you explain the difference between a rebellion you once called principled and a rebellion that now feels like a threat? I started turning this over while reading about Alexander Hamilton. One thing that kept showing up in Hamilton's writing was his overwhelming anxiety. In the years after independence, he warned that the United States had reached, quote, almost the last stage of national humiliation, end quote. That doesn't sound like someone who thinks the revolution settled anything permanently. It sounds like someone bracing for the next fracture. And that's what pulled me into this episode, because the founders weren't just revolutionaries. They were the first people to inherit what comes after a revolution, the part where ideals have to become systems and resistance has to become governance. They knew what rebellion looked like. They had lived it. They had justified it to themselves, to each other, and to the world. And then they had to decide what to do when the same energy showed up again, this time pointed inward. Some uprisings were treated as intolerable. They weren't absorbed into national mythology. They weren't remembered as brave or clever. They were suppressed and fast. So the question I want to sit with in this episode is simple, but it's not easy. How do you justify rebellion when you're fighting for freedom, and then justify suppressing it once freedom is yours? What I keep coming back to isn't whether that shift was justified, though, but really what I'm coming back to is what it took psychologically and philosophically to make it feel justified to them in that moment. And what did they have to tell themselves about legitimacy, stability, and what the country could survive in order to hold both ideas at the same time? Because if you want to understand why the later uprisings felt so threatening to them, you have to rewind to the rebellion that eventually became a sacred story. You have to rewind to the Boston Tea Party before it was founding myth, before it felt inevitable, before anyone knew how the story would end. So let's rewind and let's get into it. One of the hardest things to recover about the Boston Tea Party is how unsettled it felt at the time. Not unsettled in a strategic sense, but emotionally. December 16th, 1773 wasn't experienced as a beginning. It wasn't experienced as a declaration of independence even. And it wasn't even experienced as a turning point, at least not yet. It felt more like a last door closing. The night itself didn't come out of nowhere. It followed weeks of meetings and speeches and petitions and delays. Again and again, people gathered at Old South Meeting House trying to talk themselves out of doing something irreversible. This is something I didn't realize. When we imagine the Tea Party now, we tend to picture decisiveness and boldness and a clear sense of right and wrong. But what the record actually shows is hesitation. According to accounts from the time, the final meeting stretched late into the evening. Thousands of people crowded inside the meeting house with more packed into the streets outside, waiting, and still, no resolution. People kept hoping for another option. That hesitation tells us something important. It suggests that people involved didn't see themselves as natural rebels. They weren't itching to escalate. They were weighing the consequences. They were worried about how far this could go. They were trying to stay within some moral boundary they could feel, but hadn't fully articulated yet. Then word spread that Governor Hutchinson had refused to allow the ships to leave Boston Harbor with the tea still aboard, meaning the tea had to be unloaded, which meant the tax had to be paid. that refusal mattered more than the tea itself. This was a signal that there would be no compromise, no delay, no acknowledgement that the protest had been heard. Only then did the movement begin toward the harbor. And even then, it wasn't rushed. People didn't surge forward in a panic. They changed clothes deliberately. Some disguised themselves and others didn't bother. The disguises weren't really about concealment. Everyone knew what was happening. It was really about symbolism, about stepping outside ordinary identity, just enough. It was a performance, but I think it was a controlled one. That control shows up again and again in the details people choose to remember. John Adams, who wasn't on the ships but followed the events closely, later described the destruction of the tea as, quote, the most magnificent movement of all, end quote. That line gets quoted a lot, but what's quoted less often is why he admired it. Adams didn't praise the Tea Party because it was destructive. He praised it because, in his view, it was disciplined. The ships weren't looted. Nothing else was damaged. When a padlock was broken, it was replaced. One witness recalled that anyone caught trying to pocket tea was publicly rebuked. That detail appears repeatedly in contemporary accounts, almost obsessively, which tells us something else. People were deeply invested in how this act would be perceived. They wanted it to be clear, to themselves as much to anyone else, that this wasn't lawlessness. This was an argument. And in late colonial America, arguments were often made through crowds. Historians like Pauline Meyer have pointed out that extra-legal protest wasn't automatically seen as irrational or criminal in this period. Crowds were often understood as enforcing community norms when normal systems failed to respond. From inside that political culture, the Tea Party didn't feel like chaos. It felt corrective. And that's how many of the participants justified it, not as a rebellion for rebellion's sake, but as an intervention, as stepping in where authority had stopped listening. They weren't rejecting authority altogether. They were rejecting an authority that felt distant, unaccountable, and maybe, most importantly, deaf to them. Taxation without representation wasn't just a constitutional argument, it was an emotional one, a sense that decisions were being made by people who would never bear the consequences. Once that belief takes hold, something shifts. Obedience stops feeling like responsibility. Resistance starts feeling like a duty. What's striking when you read the letters and accounts from that time is how little overtly revolutionary language appears before the Tea Party. People weren't yet calling openly for independence. They weren't talking about overthrowing British rule. They were asking, sometimes desperately, for the recognition, just for the response, for proof that protest still worked within the system. The Tea Party wasn't designed to end empire. It was designed to force attention. This reframes the act not as a radical rupture, but as an escalation after repeated failure. This is where hindsight starts to distort things, because we know what comes next. We know Britain responds with punishment. They close the port, and they tighten control, and they isolate Massachusetts. We know that response radicalizes people who hadn't supported the Tea Party at all. But at the time, none of that was guaranteed. The Tea Party could have isolated Boston. It could have split the colonies. It could have backfired entirely. That risk was real, and people understood that, which is why the British response mattered so much. Because when punishment came, it didn't restore legitimacy. It confirmed what protesters feared, that protests would not be met with engagement, only force. It wasn't the tea that finally broke trust. It was the response. Only after that did the Tea Party begin to harden into something larger, not just an event, but a justification, proof that resistance had been necessary all along. Because it means legitimacy wasn't assigned in the moment of action. It was assigned later, like once power revealed how it intended to respond, and that's where memory begins to shift. By the time Adams is calling the Tea Party magnificent, it's no longer just about tea. It's about what followed, about how the act fit into a broader narrative of overreach and correction. That's the version of the story we inherit. But before it became myth, before it felt inevitable or obvious, it was uncertain. It was contested. It was justified in real time by people trying to decide how far was too far. That's the mindset that we need to hold on to. After independence, the framework really did change, and not just symbolically. Authority was no longer coming from Parliament across an ocean. It was coming from Americans, from a government that claimed to represent the people enforcing its laws. But that authority was also new. It was untested. It was held together by paper, precedent, and trust that hadn't fully formed yet. The pressure didn't disappear. The grievances didn't disappear. What changed was who was now responsible for responding to them. So when the same logic reappeared, when protest and disruption and refusal came to light, the question wasn't whether it looked familiar. It was whether a government this young could survive being challenged in the same way the old one had been. That's where the story turns. One thing that's easy to forget about the years immediately after independence is just how little confidence anyone actually had. The revolution had succeeded, yes, but success did not feel permanent. It didn't feel secure. It felt provisional, like something that could still be undone by a handful of wrong decisions or a few bad years stacked together. At this point, the country was deeply in debt. The economy was uneven and fragile. The new federal government existed more on paper than in practice. For many Americans, especially those living far from coastal cities, the nation they just fought for didn't even feel like a protector yet. It felt abstract and distant and sometimes intrusive. Which is why, when unrest began to surface in western Pennsylvania in the early 1790s, it didn't immediately register as something new. It felt, if anything, familiar. The spark was an excise tax on distilled spirits passed in 1791. From the perspective of the federal government, it was a practical decision. The tax helped fund the national debt and stabilize the government's credit, something leaders like Alexander Hamilton believed was essential if the republic was going to survive in a skeptical world. But for farmers on the frontier, whiskey wasn't a luxury. It was currency. Grain was bulky and difficult to transport across mountains. Turning it into whiskey made it portable, storable, tradable. In many rural communities, whiskey functioned as money itself, a medium of exchange in places where cash was scarce. So when the federal government taxed it, the impact wasn't symbolic, it was personal. And once again, people felt unheard. The tax had been passed by legislators far away. It was enforced by federal officials who didn't live among them, and it was enforced in ways that hit small frontier farmers hardest, favoring large producers and punishing noncompliance quickly, and ignoring how central whiskey was to everyday survival in those communities. Those feelings mattered more than the tax rate. Resistance didn't begin violently. It followed a familiar arc. There were petitions and complaints and legal challenges, requests for reconsideration, and when those failed, when it became clear that the law would be enforced regardless, the tone shifted. Intimidation followed. And what's striking is how many people involved believed sincerely that they were acting in the spirit of the revolution. In petitions and letters, protesters described the tax as, quote, hostile to the liberties of the people, and, quote, inconsistent with the spirit of the Constitution, end quote. One organizer warned that when government becomes destructive of liberty and equality, it's the right of the people to resist. That's not accidental phrasing. It's a direct inheritance from the revolution itself. This wasn't the language of lawlessness. It was the language of inheritance. Inside those communities, this didn't feel like chaos. It felt like a continuation. And eventually, this was widespread enough to alarm federal officials, but not so disorganized that it felt anarchic to those participating in it. There was structure and intention, and there was a belief that pressure, once again, might force attention. And that's what makes the response so revealing. Because this time, the people deciding how to react weren't imperial officials across an ocean. They were the architects of the republic itself. Men like Hamilton, who had once argued fiercely against distant, unaccountable authority, now found themselves defending federal power as essential, even fragile. To him, the rebellion wasn't really about whiskey, it was about precedent. In a 1794 letter discussing the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton warned that failure to act decisively would, quote, destroy the energy of government and pave the way to anarchy and disunion, end quote. Writing under the pseudonym Tully during the crisis, Hamilton argued that resistance to the excise tax was, quote, a daring spirit of resistance to the laws, calculated to inspire a general spirit of disobedience, end quote. If the government backed down, what would that teach the country? That the laws were optional, or that enforcement depended on popularity? That resistance, which was once effective, could be endlessly replicated? Hamilton had lived through the collapse of authority under the Articles of Confederation. He had watched debts go unpaid. States ignore federal requests. Foreign powers dismiss the United States as unserious. Those memories weren't theoretical, they were recent. So when he looked at the unrest in Pennsylvania, he didn't see expression. He saw infection. And this is where the emotional register changes, because the founders weren't responding as rebels anymore. They were responding as caretakers of a system that felt extremely young, exposed, and alarmingly easy to undermine. For George Washington, the situation cut even deeper. Washington wasn't just the president at this point, he was the symbol of the revolution's success, the embodiment of unity, the person that people trusted to hold the country together. If anyone could have treated the rebellion as noise or waited it out, it was him. Instead, he took it personally. To Washington, defiance of federal law wasn't just disagreement over policy, it was a challenge to the legitimacy of the republic itself, a signal that the experiment might fail, not because of foreign invasion or imperial pressure, but because Americans refused to accept authority once it was their own. By the summer of 1794, things in western Pennsylvania had gone from simmering to openly confrontational. Federal tax collectors weren't just being ignored anymore, they were being threatened. Some were attacked, and one was famously tarred and feathered. Federal court officials were harassed, and mail was intercepted. Armed groups began gathering at night, and they were drilling and talking openly about resistance. In July, a group of rebels attacked the home of John Neville, a federal tax inspector. Shots were eventually fired, and Neville's house was eventually burned to the ground. This event feels like a turning point in the rebellion, because up until then, this unrest could still be framed as intimidation or posturing or symbolic resistance. Burning Neville's house crossed a psychological line. It made the conflict visible in a way that letters and petitions hadn't. News of the attack spread fast, and this is where the federal response kicks into gear. So at this point, Washington decides to act, and it's not subtle. He doesn't send a warning letter or wait it out, and he doesn't offer to quietly negotiate behind the scenes. He calls up the militia, and not just from one state. He authorizes nearly 13,000 troops from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia as a force larger than many Revolutionary War battles. The scale was intentional. This wasn't just about fighting a war, it was about being seen. Washington personally reviews the troops, and at this point, he's 62 years old. He mounts a horse and rides at the head of the army. Not all the way to Pennsylvania, but far enough to make the point unmistakable. This is the first and only time a sitting U.S. president will lead troops in the field. Here's the part that almost never gets talked about. The rebels expected a confrontation. Some believed other regions would rise up with them. Others assumed the federal government would hesitate or fracture or negotiate. There was a sense, inherited directly from the Revolution, that mass resistance would force a reckoning. Instead, what they see is overwhelming force moving steadily west. There were no speeches or bargaining. There was no drama, just soldiers. By the time the army actually reaches the region, the rebellion has already started to collapse. Men who had gathered in defiance end up scattering. Some flee into the hills, others quietly return home. Meetings dissolve and flags just disappear. The resistance evaporates almost without a fight. This is no climactic battle or heroic last stand, which is, frankly, the point. Eventually, federal troops arrest about 150 men. Most end up being released. Only 2 are convicted of treason, and Washington later pardons both of them. That detail, I think, is important because the goal was never mass punishment. It really was just about setting precedent. The government wanted to prove 3 things. 1, it could enforce the federal law. 2, it would not tolerate organized defiance. And 3, it didn't need to be cruel to be powerful. The rebellion ends not with bloodshed, but with dissolution. And that quiet ending is exactly why it's hard to remember. So I think it's fair to say that in their minds, the Tea Party had resisted tyranny. The Whiskey Rebellion threatened order. That distinction, I think, is what mattered deeply to them. And yet, when you just step back slightly, the similarities remain hard to ignore. Both involved taxes perceived as unfair. Both involved people far from centers of power. Both escalated after failed appeals, and both relied on symbolic disruption to force attention. What had changed wasn't the behavior. It was where authority now sat. Before independence, resistance had a clear direction. It was aimed outward, at a distant authority that didn't claim to represent the people resisting it. After independence, that changed. The same tactics, refusal, intimidation, and disruption, were now aimed at the system the founders had just built themselves. A system they believed was legitimate and representative and still fragile enough to fail. From inside power, rebellion didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt personal and destabilizing, and it raised a question they hadn't had to answer before, which was, what happens if resistance doesn't stop once it works? This is the part of the story that tends to get flattened later on because it's uncomfortable. It complicates the idea that legitimacy is obvious in the moment or that rebellion can always be cleanly sorted into the right and wrong. But when you sit with it, what comes through isn't hypocrisy, it's fear. Fear that the country would splinter, or a fear that laws wouldn't hold, or fear that the logic of resistance, once proven effective, couldn't be contained. The revolution had taught Americans how to challenge authority. It hadn't taught them how to live inside a system where authority needed to survive. That's the tension the Whiskey Rebellion exposes. The founders weren't rejecting protest as an idea. They were reacting to the risk that disruption could be the default response to every grievance, not because people were malicious, but because it had just worked. From Western Pennsylvania, that fear didn't look nearly as clear. The government still felt distant and blind to local reality. Representation existed on paper, but trust hadn't caught up to that yet. And from that vantage point, resistance didn't feel like treason. Which leaves us with the question of the hour, and with the question they were struggling to answer in real time. How do you draw a line that feels necessary from the center of power when it doesn't look legitimate from the edges? If the founders could see the similarities, and they did, what allowed them to justify treating these moments so differently? What kind of reasoning made one disruption feel like an origin story and the other like an existential threat? That's what I want to dive into next. Not to judge it, but to understand how it formed. One of the reasons the Founding Fathers are so compelling and so hard to sit with is that they don't leave us guessing. They wrote constantly, they argued publicly, and they defended themselves in real time. So when I started asking how they could see the Boston Tea Party as legitimate resistance while treating later uprisings as intolerable, I realized something pretty quickly. I didn't need to infer their reasoning. They tell us. But they don't tell us in one clean argument. There isn't a single moment where someone stands up and says, "Here's the rule now." Instead, it emerges gradually across essays and letters and proclamations as a set of overlapping anxieties that start to harden into logic. Anxieties about fragility, about precedent, about responsibility. And once those anxieties settle into a framework, that framework becomes usable and portable and almost repeatable. I kept coming back to Alexander Hamilton because if anyone gives us a window into the shift, it's him. When Hamilton lays out his fears in the Federalist Papers, he isn't theorizing in abstract. These essays were written because the country still felt extremely fragile, because independence hadn't solved the problem of whether Americans would accept being governed at all. In Federalist Number 9, Hamilton is preoccupied with instability. He's not warning that republics collapse because they lack ideals. He assumes ideals are abundant. What he worries about is disorder, about what happens when a system can't contain its own internal conflicts. He leans heavily on history here, pointing to past republics that unraveled not from invasion, but from faction, from internal resistance that slowly eroded authority until nothing could hold. What struck me rereading this wasn't the fear itself. Fear makes sense. The country really was super fragile. What struck me was how rebellion starts to change shape in his language. It's no longer framed as moral expression. It's not corrective. It becomes a symptom, a sign that the system isn't asserting itself strongly enough. By the time of the Whiskey Rebellion, which was well after the Federalist Papers that were done by 1787, that framing isn't theoretical anymore. Hamilton pushes hard for enforcement, and not because the whiskey tax is flawless, he knew it wasn't, but because allowing defiance felt dangerous in a way that went beyond the policy itself. What he's worried about isn't today's resistance, it's tomorrow's copycat. Once people learn that pressure works, once they learn that disruption forces attention, What stops that logic from spreading? That concern shows up again and again in his writing, not as moral outrage, but as fear of precedent, fear that the federal government will reveal itself as optional. And this is where historians like Gordon S. Wood become really helpful. Wood argues that the period after independence marks a psychological turning point. That revolution radically expanded political expectations. Ordinary people learned that resistance could work, that authority could be challenged, and that crowds could force change. And once independence was achieved, that lesson didn't just disappear. It turned inward. From that perspective, uprisings like the Whiskey Rebellion aren't strange at all. They're the revolution echoing back at its creators, the same energy redirected. And that echo was unsettling. Not because the founders suddenly forgot what an injustice looked like, but because they now had something to lose. Which brings me to George Washington, because his role here is often described as reluctant, as if he acted against his instincts. But when you read his statements closely, what you see isn't reluctance, it's kind of a gravity. Washington doesn't frame the rebellion as disagreement, he frames it as defiance, as a refusal to accept outcomes produced by a representative system. Once authority is understood as legitimate, once it's constitutional and representative and accountable, resistance to it stops looking like protest and starts looking like threat. What's notable is what Washington doesn't say. He doesn't accuse the farmers of immorality. He doesn't dwell on their character. He talks instead about destabilization. And in a fragile republic, destabilization becomes a moral problem. This is where historians like Pauline Maier add crucial texture. Maier's work reminds us that colonial Americans had long relied on crowd action as a political tool. Extralegal protest wasn't automatically criminal or irrational. It was often seen as a way communities enforced norms when institutions failed. And that didn't suddenly change in 1776. What changed was elite tolerance. Before independence, crowds could be framed as enforcing justice against distant authority. After independence, the same crowds raised an uncomfortable question. What does it mean if people still feel the need to act outside the system we just built? From that angle, suppressing rebellion doesn't feel like a betrayal of revolutionary ideals. It feels like a defense of them. That's how the logic holds together. The founders weren't saying rebellion was always wrong. They were saying that rebellion against this system was different. Because in their minds, this system had something the old one didn't. It had representation, it had process, and it had legitimacy. And once you accept that premise, the conclusions follow quietly. Historians like Terry Boughton push this even further, pointing out that the revolution raised expectations it couldn't fully meet, especially for rural and working-class Americans. Economic inequality didn't vanish after independence. In some places, it deepened. From that perspective, rebellions like the Whiskey Uprising weren't irrational. They were predictable. But predictability doesn't make them tolerable to those in power, especially leaders who believe the survival of the Republic depended on proving, early and clearly, that laws would be enforced, even unpopular ones. When I step back and look at all this together, it is probably easy to label all of this as hypocrisy, but what I see is an act of triage, a belief even that the choice was between imperfect enforcement and systemic collapse, and that belief shaped everything that followed. And it's easy to miss how reasonable many of their fears were. The Republic really was fragile and the precedent really did matter. But sitting with this moment longer, something else starts to emerge. Legitimacy for them wasn't just about ideals, it was about control, about whether the structure could hold once pressure was applied. And once authority becomes responsible for holding things together, it starts sorting disruption differently, not just by motive or grievance, but by risk. The Tea Party becomes acceptable because it targeted an external power and ultimately succeeded. The Whiskey Rebellion becomes unacceptable because it targeted the internal structure and threatened to reveal how easily that structure could fracture. Once that's all articulated, it's not hard to notice how durable it is. Because this way of reasoning doesn't disappear when the founders do. It becomes something that can be reused, a way of explaining why one act of defiance becomes a founding story and another becomes a cautionary tale, not because the behaviors are radically different, but because one fits inside survival and the other threatens it. When the Whiskey Rebellion faded from public life, it didn't feel, at least on the surface, like a moment that required much reflection. The unrest had been suppressed. Federal authority had held, and the country hadn't fractured in the way so many people feared it might. Life moved on. And because life moved on, something quieter began to happen in the background. Not a political shift exactly, more like a psychological one. We often think of justification as something that precedes action, a reason people offer in advance, a rationale meant to explain why something must be done. But in moments like this, justification doesn't always arrive first. Sometimes it finishes its work afterward. Once the danger has passed and the feared outcome never arrives. Once the system holds, it becomes easier to believe it always would have. Once collapse doesn't come, the choices made under pressure start to feel less provisional and more correct. Certainty has a way of settling in after the fact. The Tea Party followed a very different path through memory. At the time, it was unsettled and risky, surrounded by hesitation and disagreement. The people involved didn't experience it as inevitable, or even obviously wise. They experienced it as a gamble. But because of what followed, because British authority responded as it did, because independence eventually held, because the revolution succeeded, that uncertainty slowly fell away, not in the moment itself, but in retrospect. Looking backward, the Tea Party starts to feel like clarity instead of improvisation. The danger that surrounded it at the time becomes harder to see once the outcome is known. The Whiskey Rebellion, by contrast, doesn't benefit from that same retrospective smoothing. The government responds forcefully, the unrest dissipates, and the Republic survives. Like I talked about in the last episode, I've been thinking a lot about how tempting it is to want history to feel settled. Not just understood, but resolved. Like we've reached the end of the thought and tied it off neatly, and now we know what it meant. The Boston Tea Party fits that impulse really well. It lets us believe that, at least once, people recognized injustice clearly, acted decisively, and history rewarded them for it. That the arc makes sense, that the risk was worth it. But when you stay close to the moment itself, when you listen to the hesitation and the uncertainty and the arguments that didn't have obvious answers yet, that clarity starts to feel thinner. That's the part I keep circling back to. Not whether the founders were right or wrong, not whether the rebellion should or should not be tolerated, but how quickly uncertainty disappears once something holds, once the republic survives, once authority proves it can enforce itself, once collapse doesn't happen. After that, it becomes easier to believe the choices made under pressure were obvious, necessary even, or inevitable. The Tea Party becomes the birth of freedom, and the Whiskey Rebellion becomes a threat neutralized. And somewhere in between, the fear, the doubt, the improvisation, the very human parts get smoothed away. But those parts matter in history because the people dumping tea into the harbor didn't know they were creating a nation. And the farmers resisting the whiskey tax didn't believe they were undermining one. Both groups were responding to pressure. Both believed the system wasn't listening. Both thought disruption was the only remaining language. It doesn't mean all rebellions are the same, and it doesn't mean legitimacy doesn't matter. But it does mean legitimacy isn't always obvious in real time. It gets built slowly through response and memory and through which explanations last. How early America learned this and how quickly it stopped feeling like a lesson, that's what I keep thinking about. The Tea Party didn't just teach Americans how to resist power. It also taught them how to justify power once it existed. And the Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority. It taught the authority how to explain itself. I'm not sure the founders realized they were creating a template here, but I think they believed they were standing in a moment unlike any before, doing the best they could with stakes that felt existential. Thanks for listening to this again. And while I have you, please consider subscribing so that you can catch every episode as soon as it drops. And send this to a friend who appreciates history that doesn't come prepackaged. I'll see you next time.